The EA UFC series has been the main series for fans of the sport for nearly 10 years now, offering up a mix of everything from simulation to arcade-based gameplay. Over the years, the game has evolved, introducing new features and mechanics to improve and sometimes mess up the player experience. However, with each new EA UFC game, certain features and mechanics have also been removed, with players either being disappointed or happy for the removals. In this video, we're going to go over the 10 things that got removed from the EA UFC series and take a closer look at what made these features special, or an annoyance, depending on who you ask, and we'll be looking at why some of the fans are asking for the return and why others want them gone forever. So let's get started with the first entry. In UFC 1, the finish the fight mechanics allowed players to continue throwing strikes even after a knockout, emulating the real-life UFC experience. The feature was included in the first post-release update and was something fans were happy to see. Unfortunately, over time, this mechanic was removed, with KOs now immediately transitioning to the fighter's victory celebration. The removal of the finish the fight mechanics came at the cost of removing a simulation-based feature and angering fans who enjoyed the feature. And let's be honest, we all like getting in a few extra punches after a huge KO. And in UFC MMA, a knockout doesn't always mean the fight is instantly over. It takes a few additional strikes before the referee can step in and stop the fight. By removing this mechanic, EA UFC games have lost a bit of that brutal edge that comes with MMA fights. UFC 1 featured a range of unique knockout animations, including the realistic and brutal fencing response where a fighter's body goes completely stiff following a KO. These canned animations added a level of realism to the game, with players reacting to how clean and brutal the knockouts could look when executed a certain way. However, they were removed in favour of the physics system introduced in UFC 2. While the new physics system has its own positives, the loss of those awesome-looking knockout animations can now be looked back as a setback for the series. The fencing response in particular was a highlight for many players, as it did mimic how brutal a KO can look in an MMA fight. The switch to a physics-based system, whilst being fun, did have its ups and downs, which we're going to look at next. UFC 2 introduced a new physics system designed to make each knockout unique, the fighters reacting in different ways based on the strike they received. While it had its glitches, with some fighters performing hilarious and unrealistic moves, it was a step forward in many ways. Like, for example, the physics-based system created more varied and realistic knockouts, with fighters falling and crumpling in ways that portrayed actual UFC KOs. Unfortunately, due to the unpredictable nature of the physics system, the feature was removed in UFC 3. The decision was a disappointment of many fans who enjoyed how satisfying a KO could be with the physics system. Trust us, whilst getting this footage for UFC 2, we couldn't stop getting KOs because it was that fun. It's a real shame that none of the KOs ever managed to emulate the feel of these ones. UFC 4 introduced the option for players to choose their fighter's pre-fight announcement animation and victory celebration, which added a little bit of a player choice to the game. However, this feature was quickly removed just one game later in UFC 5. The post-selection feature, whilst having its own quirks, was definitely seen as an unnecessary interruption, with many just wanting to skip through them after only using them a few times. The removal of these poses has largely been seen as a positive change, as many players just wanted to get right into the action or skip past the victory scenes to get to the next fight. The change has now made everything when it comes to announcements and victories just flow a little bit better in UFC 5. Rogan is seen as the voice of UFC, and he was a part of EA UFC series until UFC 3. After that, he was replaced by Daniel Cormier to join Jon Anik, as Rogan did not want to continue recording voiceover for the games. Many of Rogan's lines in the games have been taken from actual UFC events due to him not wanting to record new lines for the game, so a decision was made to instead have Cormier replace him, so they could make the commentary flow a bit better with actual back and forths. In UFC 3, for example, it sounded like Joe Rogan was just randomly there rather than actually part of the broadcast, as he had no lines that would acknowledge Jon Anik being his broadcast partner due to the lack of new lines. The absence of Joe Rogan from the EA UFC series can be seen as disappointing for many, as he is the voice of UFC. And with them still doing events for the UFC pay-per-views, having his voice for the games just adds authenticity to the series. His commentary was a significant part of the players, especially for the casual fan who would be wondering why his voice wasn't in the UFC series when they hear him for pretty much every UFC pay-per-view. Though the change was understandable and had to be done. UFC Ultimate Team was a game mode introduced in UFC 2 and carried over into UFC 3, with having similar features of other EA Sports Ultimate Team modes such as FIFA and Madden. In this mode, players could create their own teams of fighters, collecting and upgrading them by opening packs that included items and moves. The team could then be used to compete against other players online with the goal of climbing the ranks and earning rewards. However, UFC Ultimate Team was removed in UFC 4. The decision to remove the mode was said to be because of lack of popularity from players of the EA UFC games, as well as criticisms that it just didn't fit well with what a UFC game is. It's not a team sport, so it just doesn't translate as well as, say, FIFA games. And let's be honest, the mode was pretty much a quick cash grab, with the packs and microtransactions. It just all fell out of place for the context of the fighting game. Instead of trying to improve and refine the mode, the developers chose to focus on other areas of the game instead. In UFC 1 and 2, the parry system allowed players to deflect opponents' strikes and counterattack, adding a bit of defensive strategy to the games. A parry, for those wondering, is a defensive move where a fighter deflects an incoming strike, opening up an opportunity for a counterattack. However, this feature was removed in UFC 3 onwards as players felt it was too overpowered. The loss of the parry system has received a mixed response by players. Some felt it took away a valuable tool that players could use to gain the upper hand in a fight, and others felt that the system was just way too overpowered and made the gameplay too unbalanced. Could we one day see a return to the parry system? If they were to do it, then of course, it would need to be done in a way that's fair to players and isn't too overpowered. Parrying is an important defensive tool in an MMA fight and should be in the games, so the developers should try to find a way to make it work, whilst being balanced. UFC 5 removed several small details that added to the overall feel, such as the glove and mouthpiece checks performed by officials before fighters enter the cage. Bruce Buffer no longer announces the weight and location of fighters during the match, and there's no entrances for 3-round fights. Now, in all fairness, they are truly small features that no one's going to say that will sorely miss, because many players likely skip through all of this anyway. But it is, however, fair to say that EA is still skipping out on that extra attention to detail that is always appreciated. I mean, take a look at UFC Undisputed 3, for example. That game is full of small details that on their own are tiny details, but together they form the most detailed MMA video game ever made. People don't forget that, and it's one of the many reasons why UFC Undisputed 3 is called the best MMA game ever. UFC 5 moved away from the submission minigames that were in previous installments, choosing to go for a more seamless approach during the ground game parts of fights. The minigames, which require players to fill bars or match the opponent in a minigame to successfully submit an opponent, added an extra layer of skill and knowledge to ground fights. However, they could be seen as clunky and disrupting the flow of fights in the EA UFC games. UFC 5's new approach streamlines the submission process, no longer making it about who could do a minigame better, though it needs to be mentioned that it has come at the cost of removing some submission moves in the process. The change from minigames to this more straightforward approach has received mostly positive reactions from fans, many who would never bother going to ground or do submissions in previous games due to the previous system. The minigames, whilst adding a slight bit of skill to the games, could often feel quite out of place when it came to a UFC fight. The new system in UFC 5 allows for a more organic and less interrupted ground combat experience. For me, it's definitely a positive change, and one that needs to keep being expanded upon. In earlier EA UFC games, players had the option to choose their referee for matches. However, in UFC 5, this option has been removed, with Herb Dean being the only available referee. This change has puzzled many fans, as it does ruin the game's simulation aspect and the level of choice that one would expect from a PS5 game now, especially when the UFC Undisputed 3 had around 6 referees to choose from. The removal of multiple referees is another step back for the series, a small one, but still a step back. The variety of referees just adds the extra bit of realism to the games. The decision to limit the player's choice to only Herb Dean could be seen as EA not licensing other real-world refs to use in the EA UFC games, maybe to save money? But let's be honest, real-life refs aren't going to be asking for a ton to be in these games. It could very well just be EA not caring at all about referee choice. So that was 10 things that the EA UFC series has removed since the first game being released in 2014. What features that have been removed do you miss the most? Did we miss anything out? If so, let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching everyone, and we'll see you in the next UFC video, where we'll be comparing EA's very first MMA game released in 2010 to 2023's UFC 5. We'll see you on that video.